glittering halls of Moscow, beneath the gilded domes that pierced the northern sky, power was measured not in gold, not in land, not in armies, but in humiliation. For Ivan IV of Russia, whom history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, ruled not only with the sword, but with spectacle. He demanded not merely obedience, but abasement. To serve him was not only to kneel, it was to crawl. There are chronicles, whispered at the edge of parchment, of evenings when the Tsar would summon his boyars, proud nobles descended from ancient lines, men who commanded estates, armies, families, and stripped them of all that made them dignified. He would order them onto their hands and knees. He would command them to bark. And in his court, filled with candlelight and shadows, the air would tremble with the sound of Russia's highest lords reduced to dogs. Some growled, some whimpered, others pawed the ground, their beards dragging in the rushes. Ivan would laugh, sometimes in delight, sometimes in sudden rage. For the game was never about amusement alone. It was about terror. The courtiers never knew which bark would please and which would earn a blow, a confiscation, or a death sentence. It was, in its own way, genius. For nothing destroys pride more completely than self-inflicted shame. The boyar, who had once stood in jeweled robes, commanding warriors, now wagged his body for the Tsar's amusement. The man who had once judged peasants in court now crawled in the dirt, hoping his mimicry of a hound might spare him punishment. Ivan had learned well the theater of domination. Fear alone binds men for a time, but fear mixed with ridicule, fear that corrodes dignity and leaves only self-contempt, binds forever. Because once a man has barked like a dog in front of his peers, he will do anything never to be reminded of it again. And so, night after night, the Kremlin became a kennel. Its gilded ceilings echoed with the panting of nobles degraded into beasts. But Ivan's cruelty did not end with mockery. Sometimes he would hurl scraps of food across the floor, forcing his courtiers to fight over them on all fours, like starving animals. Sometimes he unleashed real hounds upon them, watching as man and beast snarled together in the dirt. Sometimes he turned the humiliation into judgment, declaring that those who barked too softly were traitors, unworthy of mercy. It was a court where laughter was indistinguishable from terror, where a smile at the Tsar's jest could be mistaken for mockery, where men crawled not because they were commanded once, but because they feared what would happen if they ever dared to stand upright again. And all the while, Ivan watched. His piercing eyes, described by witnesses as glinting like steel in firelight, studied his nobles as one might study animals in a cage. He measured loyalty in groveling, courage in silence, survival in degradation. This was not madness alone, it was calculation, because Ivan, besieged by paranoia, surrounded by plots both real and imagined, understood that the surest way to break the spine of rebellion was not with the axe, but with shame. A man humiliated is a man already half executed. He carries the wound in his soul. And so long as he remembers the sound of his own voice barking in the Tsar's chamber, he will never again have the strength to raise it in defiance. Thus did the most powerful men in Russia become Ivan's pack. But what of those who refused? What of those whose pride could not bend to such degradation? For them, there was no laughter, no kennel games, only the axe, the knout, or the slow descent into the tortures of the Tsar's dungeons. And so the choice was simple. Bark or die. This was the world of Ivan the Terrible, a world where humanity itself was a privilege granted or stripped at the whim of the Tsar. The spectacle of humiliation was only the surface of Ivan's theater. Beneath it lay something darker, an empire of terror that he crafted with meticulous care. Because Ivan's demand that his nobles crawl like animals was not a passing cruelty. It was the essence of his reign, distilled into ritual. It was the visible mask of a deeper philosophy, that no man, however ancient his lineage, however vast his estates, however sharp his sword, could ever stand taller than the Tsar. And so, as the boyars barked, another sound began to echo through Russia, the hoofbeats of the oprichniki, These were Ivan's chosen executioners, his black-clad enforcers, sworn not only to obey him, but to embody his rage. They rode across the land cloaked in darkness, with severed dogs' heads hanging from their saddles and brooms tied to their horses' flanks. The message was unmistakable. They sniffed out treason, and they swept it away. The courtiers who once barked for the Tsar in jest soon found themselves hunted like the very beasts they had pretended to be. One day, they crawled at his feet, their laughter hollow. The next, they might be dragged into the square, accused of conspiracy, stripped of title and estate, their families scattered, their bodies broken. Because Ivan's games were never just games. They were rehearsals for annihilation. The nobles who had learned to bark learned too late that the kennel was only a holding pen before slaughter. And yet, paradoxically, the more Ivan punished them, the more desperately they groveled. Terror had fused humiliation into loyalty, and loyalty under Ivan meant nothing more than survival until tomorrow. It was said that when Ivan watched his boyars crawling on all fours, he would sometimes mutter that they were truer beasts than his hounds, because at least a dog defends its master out of instinct, while the noble debased himself out of fear. In that moment, Ivan believed himself the only true man in Russia. All others were reduced to animals in his menagerie. But there is a paradox to tyranny. When power is built on fear and degradation, it cannot inspire devotion. It can only inspire silence. And silence is brittle. The courtiers obeyed. The peasants obeyed. Even the clergy bent under Ivan's shadow. But in their obedience was no love, no respect, only terror. And terror, though sharp as a knife, is always pointed at both ends. Because the man who humiliates all must also live knowing that all secretly hate him. And Ivan knew. He saw it in their eyes, even as they barked. He heard it in their trembling voices, even as they pledged loyalty. He smelled it in their fear, like sweat thickening the air of his chambers. It fed his paranoia. It sharpened his suspicion. And so he demanded even greater acts of abasement, even bloodier demonstrations of loyalty, even louder cries to drown out the whisper that he could not silence. They obey me only because they fear me. If ever the fear falters, I am undone. Thus Ivan spiraled deeper into his cruelty, turning every banquet into a trial, every jest into a sentence, every game into a test of survival. The court became not a place of governance, but a stage where humiliation and execution mingled until no one could tell them apart. And through it all, the courtiers crawled. They barked. They played their roles, knowing that dignity was long dead, that pride was long buried. For in Ivan's Russia, to stand upright was to sign your own death warrant. And so they crawled, until their knees bled, until their voices cracked, until their souls withered into silence. The hall that once echoed with laughter now trembled with unease. For what began as humiliation in play soon spilled into humiliation in blood. Ivan's court was not only the theatre of dogs, but the laboratory of fear. And as his cruelty deepened, so too did the shadow it cast over his own house. Because when a ruler teaches the world that dignity is worthless, he does not merely strip it from his nobles, he strips it from himself and from his heirs. The boyars were not the only ones to crawl. The Tsar demanded submission from his own family. His sons were born not into warmth, but into suspicion. His wives were not companions, but pawns, discarded or executed when his paranoia whispered treachery. Every chamber of the Kremlin became another stage, every corridor another kennel. And then came the breaking point. It was November of 1581. Ivan, already haunted by visions and racked by fits of fury, burst into his son's chambers. His heir, also named Ivan, was young, ambitious, and bold enough to question his father. And in that moment, boldness was fatal. Words turned to shouts, shouts turned to blows. The Tsar's scepter, heavy and iron-bound, came crashing down. His own son's skull split beneath it. Blood pooled across the floor. The cries of servants froze in their throats, and in that silence, Ivan the Terrible stared at the ruin he had wrought, not of a noble, not of a peasant, but of his blood, his future, his name. They say he wept. They say he cradled the dying body, screaming that he had not meant it. But what meaning could there be in a man who had demanded others bark like animals? What innocence could remain in a hand that had forced nobles to crawl, that had unleashed the Oprichniki, that had turned a throne into a butcher's block? The sun died. The dynasty cracked. Russia's future, like the skull of the air, was shattered, and the courtiers, they saw, they learned. They understood what Ivan himself never could, that tyranny devours not only its victims, but its master. That a ruler who demands others crawl may one day slip upon the very floor he forces them to abase themselves upon. When Ivan died 3 years later, Russia did not weep. It collapsed into chaos. The time of troubles began. Famines, impostors, wars that nearly tore the realm apart. The Tsar who had once stood tall over kneeling boyars left behind not stability, but a kingdom broken in body and spirit. And so the image remained, a hall of nobles on all fours, barking as their Tsar laughed. Not a joke, not a jest, but a prophecy of what Russia would endure. For a nation humiliated by its ruler will always carry scars deeper than its ruler's reign. Ivan the Terrible believed himself the only man among beasts, but history remembers him not as a master, nor as a god, nor as a savior. It remembers him as the man who built an empire of crawling dogs and was destroyed by the echo of his own growl.